We're going to talk about blank lines now in Python and how Python uses blank spaces in its programs. So if we look at the code on the left there, you notice all the blank lines that appear in between some of the lines of code. How important do you think those blank lines are? That is, if we took them all out and squished all the code together like that, do you think the code would still work? Well, it turns out that Python is okay with having spaces in between the lines of code. So you can take that and squish it all together and that would work, or you could insert a whole bunch of different spaces in between the lines of code and that would work as well. Now, the reason why you would have spaces or why you would put spaces into your code is for human readability. So it doesn't matter to Python, but it would matter to a human who might be looking at your code and trying to understand what your code does, or particularly if you are a teacher and you're looking at your students' code, you would encourage them to lay out their code in a nice way so everything's not all squished together and makes it hard for you to mark and give them A+. So we talked about spaces in between lines of code. Now we're going to talk about spaces inside lines of code. So we saw how we can display print hello world before. I'm going to do this part in the editor because then you can get a better sense of how it might look, okay? So, what if we put spaces in here? Would that still work? So space between the print and the bracket. Well, let's just run it and see if it still works. It does, right? So I'm running it and it still displays hello world. So that is fine. What if I put spaces now between the bracket and the quotation marks, like here? What would happen now, do you think? Do you think out of two options, it would still display the same thing? Or do you think it would now push in the hello world a bit further so that there is a bit of a margin between the H and the left-hand side of the console? What do you think? Well, let's run it and see. Okay, it does not display those spaces between the brackets and the quotation marks. Okay, so those spaces actually don't matter. So what happens now? Let's just undo that. What happens now if I put spaces between the quotation mark and the first letter in the text we want to display? So the spaces are now here. What do you think would happen now? Well, let's run it. Okay, now you see that the text is pushed in because everything that is in between the quotation marks is displayed, and if we put spaces in between the quotation marks, those spaces would be also displayed. Okay, so let's get rid of that. Now, what do you think would happen if I put a space in between the letters of the word print? What do you think? Would that still work, or would Python have a problem with that? Well, let's check it out. Okay, Python has a problem with that. So it no longer recognizes it as the print function or the print command because we've actually put spaces. So that's no good. We can't break apart words like that. The last thing I'd talk about is, what do you think would happen if I put spaces before the print word, like that? Let's check it out. Okay, that would also not work. And the thing is, the reason why this last case doesn't work is because spaces that are inserted before the line of code like this are special and they're called indents. And indents are used later on when we learn about if statements and loops. Okay, so there is a special meaning for spaces that are put in front of the lines of code. So it doesn't work if under certain conditions. Okay, so let's keep everything the way it was and things go back to working fine.